Hey folks, so in this video I'll be talking about time management, which is a topic I've wanted to cover for a while, as I think virtually all tournament players do struggle with their time management at some point in their chess careers. I think typically people fall into one of two categories. Either you're someone who kind of gets into time trouble way too frequently and you end up losing games because of it, because everyone plays worse when they're down to minutes and seconds on the clock, and inevitably you're just going to blunder in that situation. And conversely, you have players in the other category who typically play a little bit too fast. They kind of rely a little bit too much on feel, and as a result, they might either blunder themselves by moving too fast and not seeing what their opponent was threatening, or more commonly, they simply might miss a tactical opportunity that they had, kind of overlooking it in favor of some kind of simpler, more obvious move. So in this video, I want to offer some tips and advice to both categories of players so that you can improve your time management for the future. Because I really do think, although this issue gets talked about a lot, it is kind of underrated from what I've seen. I notice a lot of players will just constantly get into time pressure and never really address this problem, even though it could be causing really, really bad practical results. So this first position here is a typical situation where I think it would be a mistake to spend too much time calculating a lot of variations here. There's not a whole lot of tension in the position. There's a couple of potential captures that white could consider, like c takes d5 or bishop takes f6, but it doesn't really take a lot of calculation to evaluate these captures. This is more about your strategic understanding of this type of position. So this is exactly the type of position where I might expect someone who runs into a lot of time trouble to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what to do, whereas in reality, there probably isn't a whole lot of difference between the many different moves that white has here. White has a lot of kind of semi-useful improving moves: a3, rook c1, queen c2, e3, h3, rook e1. All of these moves are approximately equal in their value, and what's really important is just coming up with some kind of plan for the position as to how you're going to improve your position over the next 3, 4, 5 moves. So I actually have no problem with someone spending some time in this position and coming up with a plan, but your thought process here has to be efficient. If you're trying to calculate concrete lines, you're not going to get very far, because black also has a ton of moves that they can play. They have rook c8, rook e8, h6, bishop d6, a6. All of these moves are reasonable from black's point of view, and it would be a mistake to try to calculate each and every one of them one by one, trying to figure out what you're going to do against it. Instead, this is a position where you should just try to come up with some kind of short/long-term plan, maybe 3, 4 moves, and play the first move that you feel like is the most efficient try or the most flexible. In this case, this came from my game. I played the move a3. I think rook c1 would have also been totally reasonable. And so I think it's totally fine to spend some time at this moment, even 10-15 minutes, but the mistake that players will make is, after black makes their response, is that they'll spend another 10 minutes in this moment to play rook c1, and then another 8 minutes to play rook c2, and just burning tons and tons of time, whereas these last few moves could have been made much quicker. I ended up going with a plan here to play rook c2 and queen a1. This is kind of a typical plan in ready type of positions, where white has this kind of very flexible setup, and I'm just fighting for the e5 square. And of course, this decision was made easier by me because I was more familiar with this type of plan, which is why one of my recommendations for players struggling with time trouble is to simply study more middle games, and especially middle games and openings that they're playing, so that you have a better idea of the typical types of plans and motives that you should be looking for. If you're getting positions in the opening that are kind of unfamiliar, and you're finding that you have to spend tons of time just to figure out what to do and what your plan is, that's a sign that you're probably not understanding that position very well, and you would save yourself a lot of time and grief in tournament games later on if you study a couple of key games in that type of opening or structure. So this next position is an example of a position where I feel like it would be very appropriate and necessary to try to spend a lot of time figuring out what's going on. And that's simply because the position that we have in front of us is obviously very sharp. There's a lot of potential tactics and threats in the position, And taking black's point of view here, it seems like our king is in a lot of trouble. The bishop on h6 is currently pinned, and white is threatening queen takes h6 mate. And this is what I think a lot of players and coaches would define as a critical moment. I think this phrase is often unclear to players as to what exactly is a critical moment and how do you know if the position in front of you is a critical moment. I kind of like Jacob Agard's definition of the phrase. He defines critical moments as any situation where there's a very clear difference between the best move and the second best move in the position. I think he says half a point or more, but this can be interpreted in different ways, and I think that makes a lot of sense. If you have a position where you might have a forced win but only one win and everything else leads to something unclear, then it would definitely be a good use of your time to try to invest some time there and figure out the right way. Or if you're defending, like in this case, where it seems like almost any move is going to be leading to mate or just immediate loss, then you might only have one saving move in the position, and it's definitely worth your time to just try to spend as much time as you possibly can in order to figure out the right solution. So this is a case where things are so sharp, it's very, very difficult to figure anything out based on feel. You simply have to be concrete about the situation and try to figure out your best way forward. Now, whether or not you'll be able to solve the difficult task in front of you is of course dependent on a lot of things, but if you leave yourself with enough time and you spend your time at the right moment when things are incredibly sharp and complicated, you at least improve your chances for figuring out the best way or at least a good move in the situation. So here, taking a look at this position, I guess the first question it would be reasonable to ask is what happens if black is playing king takes g6 and grabbing this knight. This seems like a very concrete, very forcing move. And unfortunately for black, after king takes g6, white again plays queen takes h6, and it turns out that this is a mate. The pawn on f7 is defended by white's bishop on b3, and black's king is just getting mated. And it turns out that it's actually very difficult to find a move here that doesn't lead to immediate checkmate for black. If you guys would like to pause the video and try to figure it out for yourselves, I think this is a great training exercise. It's black to play and try to survive. And basically there's only one way in the position to actually get out of this trouble. And that's through the very, very sharp, very concrete move, rook takes c2. So the basic point of this move is that we're trying to distract white's bishop away from defending the f7 pawn. So if bishop takes c2 here, then black can go ahead and grab this knight on g6, and after white plays queen takes h6, black is able to play king takes f7, and black is left with an extra piece. It still looks like a sharp position, of course. Black's king is by no means safe, but white doesn't have any kind of immediate and winning follow-ups here, and so for the moment black is surviving and probably better. Instead, after rook takes c2, if white were to take with the king, then after a takes b3, this move is now coming with check, meaning that white is not in time to play queen takes h6. White has to react to the check, and then next black can take the knight on g6 and is again escaping with the king. So this rook takes c2 move, this is not something that I would classify as thematic. I think this is just a very concrete resource that happens to work in this position. If white's king was on b1 in this situation, then black's position would just be lost, and well, the time you spent looking for some kind of defense would not be in vain, as well there was nothing you could have done anyway, so you might as well spend that time there just looking for any possible resource or even something to make things a little bit trickier for the opponent. In this case, rook takes c2 ends up saving the position, and this is only a move, even if you're a very strong player, that could have been found through direct concrete calculation. Something you're not able to do if, for example, you left yourself with 30 seconds in this position. There would be very, very little chance of figuring out the right defensive move. So now I want to talk about the other group of players who play a little bit too fast, a little bit too much relying on feel, and why that's a problem as well. This is just a sample game that I thought might illustrate the point. We have a Rui Lopez here, and in this game white plays the move d3, which is a very normal developing move. The main line is typically to play castles. where black often goes bishop e7, and now white can play either d3 or rook e1, and then black usually goes b5, bishop b3, and then d6. In this game, white plays the move d3, and black just kind of reacts with bishop e7, just kind of following their typical protocol, and white continues the same way, simply castles, black goes b5, bishop b3, and then d6. And so to a lot of players it might seem like, okay, it's a totally normal opening, nothing dramatic has happened, but in fact both players actually overlooked something pretty serious. After white played the move d3, white was actually installing a threat of bishop takes c6, followed by knight takes e5. Before the move d3, this was not possible due to the fact that white's pawn on e4 was also hanging, and so black can either take this one back immediately or just play queen d4 and win it back with the queen. But once white plays the move d3, the pawn on e4 is now protected, and white has this threat of bishop takes c6, winning a pawn. And so black kind of doesn't really realize that white has kind of switched up the opening on them now that the e4 pawn is protected. Bishop e7 is not a great move, just leaving the e5 pawn undefended. Had white castled instead, and black played bishop e7, well, here the e4 pawn is still unprotected, and black is not worried about bishop takes c6, can save b5 for another time. And so black makes this mistake with bishop to e7, and then white makes the same exact mistake to castle, not paying attention to the opponent's move, not realizing that now bishop takes c6 would in fact win a pawn. Most Ruy Lopez players are usually not expecting to be able to make bishop takes c6 work. They're familiar that usually black is able to just win back the e4 pawn, but in this case that's concretely not happening. So if you're a player who sometimes plays a little bit too quickly, I think this is like a typical example of what might happen. Your opponent might make an opening mistake, and you won't really spend any time in that position trying to exploit it, probably thinking there was nothing to exploit in the first place. However, if you spend a little bit of time and just try to consider, well, is my opponent's move dubious? Is there any way I can take advantage of it? Then you would likely figure out the solution very quickly and be able to punish them. So I think this is probably one of the most common ways that it can backfire on you to play fast. There are certainly advantages to playing quickly. You can put pressure on your opponent, and if later on, if you have more time than your opponent does in a complicated situation, I think this is a pretty serious advantage in and of itself. However, I think there are a lot of players who definitely take it a little bit too far, and as a result, they're often just playing the first move that they see in the position, the first obvious move that doesn't seem to blunder anything, and as a result, missing tactical opportunities. This next position is another example of when, if you're someone who's playing a little bit too quickly, you might miss tactical opportunities. Here in this game between Spassky and Hübner, two really strong players, black played the move bishop takes d3. And here I think most players would simply play the move queen takes d3 in response pretty quickly. It doesn't really make sense to take with the rook, as the rook on g3 is clearly very active on the g-file, and so it feels like white doesn't really have much of a choice here and should just play queen takes d3. But it's exactly in these moments where your move is not 100% forced. White has a ton of legal moves in the position, but it feels forced, that you should really just try to pause for at least a couple seconds to identify if you have any other options in the position. Superficially, it feels like we have two options, queen takes d3 and rook takes d3, and based on strategic considerations, the taking with the queen is clearly superior. But that does rule out basically every other move that does not involve recapturing the bishop, and in most cases there's not going to be any other move. But for those few cases where we do have a third option that turns out to win the game, you would really be doing yourself a disservice if you didn't try to at least pause in various moments and looking for those possible moves. So any situation where it feels like your move is forced but it's not actually forced, I would suggest spending at least a couple seconds to identify if you have any other candidate moves in the position, and if you do see an interesting opportunity, you can then spend more time, invest a little bit of time calculating that one. If it wins the game, then great, that was time well spent. If it doesn't work, then hopefully don't spend too much time trying to calculate it, and then you can go back and play the obvious move in the position. So this is a good exercise if you'd like to pause the video and try to figure out what's white's actual strongest move here that's not queen takes or rook takes d3. Feel free to do so. And in this game, Spassky finds the really powerful move queen to h6. So completely ignoring the fact that his bishop on d3 was just captured and going after a counterattack. And this is actually a pretty typical theme, I think, in these types of situations. If you're going to make some kind of move, some kind of in-between move, after your opponent has captured something and you're not recapturing, it's usually going to be some kind of powerful counterattack where you attack something of more value. In this case, the enemy king, but it can also be threats to heavy pieces, rooks and queens. So here white is starting to play rook takes g7, which is a mate in 2 threat. At first glance, it feels like black can actually defend this one a number of ways, queen d7, queen f8, and so on. But it turns out that white actually has kind of a second threat in the position, one that had to have been seen in advance, otherwise the idea doesn't really work. And the point is that after queen d7 or queen f8, any of these moves, white can take twice on g7, probably starting with bishop takes g7, after rook takes g7, rook takes g7, queen takes g7, white has queen takes e6 check, and winning the rook on c8 with check with a completely winning position. White will have more material and black's king will be extremely weak. And so this line basically works regardless of which square black's queen defends the g7 pawn. White just takes twice on g7, takes on e6, and wins the game. So this definitely isn't an easy combination to see. This is not an easy tactic to find. Spassky, was a world champion. But I think there are a lot of moments like this where if you just pause at the right moment and give yourself a couple seconds to think and consider options, I'm sure a lot of players much weaker than Spassky considered the move queen to h6. Because if you're asked to pause in this moment and you're supposed to look for forcing moves, there's not a whole lot of moves that are even going to come to mind in this position. Now, whether you see the full line with queen takes e6, it depends on your strength, but the point is, if you learn to pause at various moments and at least give yourself a chance, you will find one of these opportunities every once in a while, and as a result, win more games because of it. So to finish up, I want to offer some suggestions for players looking to improve their time management. Number one, if you're someone who is often getting into time trouble, what I would recommend is to play a lot of tournament games or training games where your main goal for that game is to not fall into time pressure. So win or lose doesn't really matter. You have to leave yourself with enough time for the critical moments. In general, I think a good amount of time to kind of strive for is to leave yourself with 30 minutes by move 30. So if there's a second time control in move 40, you'll have 30 minutes to make those last 10 moves. And even if there's no second time control, if you have 30 minutes for the rest of the game, I still feel like that mark of moves 30 through 40, this is often when the game typically gets extremely sharp, extremely complicated, and you simply need time to calculate lines. If you can do this enough time, I think eventually you'll break the habit and be a lot better about managing your time in the future. And you'll kind of learn how to find that balance between playing a little bit quicker and more intuitive positions and slowing down and calculating more when the situation gets sharp and you feel like there might be a critical move that you need to find. For players that play too quickly, of course, the advice for you is pretty simple. Slow down, allow yourself to be more concrete in the opening and early middle game, and try to consider more than one option every move. From what I found working with students is that if they're playing too quickly, they're typically just finding the first move that isn't an obvious blunder and kind of looks normal and just going with that. But my suggestion for you guys would be to just try to consider as many different options as you can when you're playing. Try to look for different types of ideas. And especially when you get moments like this where it seems like you have a forced reply, take a couple seconds and make sure you don't have any opportunities. And if your tactical vision is good and you spot that queen h6 might be something worth looking into, then have the wisdom to spend a little bit more time in that moment and try to figure out what to do. Of course, in concrete situations, if you have the time to spend, there's really a lot of upside to be gained from spending more time in those situations. And so I recommend that you try to just be as concrete as possible and try to calculate as accurately as possible and spend as much time as you need to figure out the best move that you can for the situation. Alright guys, hopefully you found this video useful. If you did, please let me know in the comments below. Do leave a like on the video and make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'll catch you next time. Take care.